Nie. Dzień dobry, dobry wieczór Państwu. Bardzo się cieszę, jest mi ogromnie miło powitać Państwa na wykładzie JeanLouis Cohena, który wspólnie Fundacja Instytut Architektury i Goethe Instytut proponują na dzisiejszy wieczór w ramach naszego cyklu, którego już którego trzecią edycję właśnie rozpoczynamy. I to jest cykl, którego nazwę ukradliśmy od Rema Koolhaasa. Nazywa się Elements of Architecture, elementy architektury. Pierwszy to był recycling, drugi bloki, a w tym roku obchodzimy stulecie Bauhausu na wyraźną też prośbę Instytutu Goethego, z czego się bardzo ucieszyliśmy. I naszą ogromną radością jest to, że udało nam się zaprosić właśnie profesora JeanLouis Cohena. Wykład będzie w języku angielskim, więc ja teraz przejdę w jakiś sposób na język angielski, żeby przedstawić naszego gościa. JeanLouis Cohen, very warm welcome here. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And I will shortly introduce you in English, but this will be yeah, okay, so I'll do it. Okay, I'll do it po polsku. Okay. To i tak będzie bardzo krótki wycinek, oczywiście, żeby nie zabierać czasu z wykładu. Natomiast no właśnie jak się okazało, że JeanLouis Cohen będzie mógł do nas przyjechać, to Dorota Jędruch tutaj obecna powiedziała, że tutaj jakby przyjechali Beatlesi. No więc dla nas to jest trochę tak właśnie. Jest architektem, historykiem sztuki, profesorem, i to jest Sheldon Solo Professor in History of Architecture na Uniwersytecie w Nowym Jorku. Wykłada również w Collège de France, także to jest chyba mniej więcej 1/3 roku w Paryżu, 1/3 w Nowym Jorku i pewnie reszta jeszcze gdzieś w powietrzu w różnych wykładach. Zajmuje się teorią architektury nowoczesnej we Francji, Niemczech i ZSRR, ale również kolonializmem i historią rozwoju przestrzennego Paryża. Jest autorem ponad 40 książek dotyczących architektury nowoczesnej i te książki to są też książki, które same zostały utytułowane. Między innymi to są Le Corbusier, An Atlas of Modern Landscapes, The Future of Architecture, czy The Architecture in the Uniform, Designing and Building for the Second World War. I te książki są często powiązane z wspaniałymi pokazami, wystawami, które JeanLouis Cohen przygotowywał między innymi w MoMA, w Nowym Jorku, w Maxi, Rzymie czy w CCA w Montrealu. I za działalność naukowo-badawczą był wielokrotnie nagradzany, a w 2015 roku został oznaczony tytułem, i to jest chyba oficer Orderu Sztuki i Literatury, przez ministra kultury i środków przekazu Republiki Francji. Oprócz tego w 2014 roku pawilon francuski kuratorowany na Biennale Wenecji przez JeanLouis Cohena został wyróżniony. Także tutaj naprawdę mogłabym jeszcze bardzo długo, ale nie chcę zabierać czasu. Tytuł dzisiejszego wykładu, który jest za mną, Bauhaus East, Bauhaus West, recepcja, wpływ na Moskwę i Paryż. So JeanLouis Cohen, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo. Dobry wieczór. I can't do much more in Polish, but I can thank all the organizers of this evening, people who have brought me to Krakow for the second time in 10 years. So Dorota Krakowska and the Goethe Institute and the architecture historian with whom I've been in contact for many years, Michał Wiśniewski, Dorota Leśniak-Rychlak, who insisted so much that I had no other choice than coming here. And in order to discuss, I could have discussed many questions, but since this year is devoted to the to a celebration of the centennial of the Bauhaus, I felt it was interesting to discuss the Bauhaus in a sort of west-east perspective. Of course, Poland is somewhere in the middle. When you go from Paris to Moscow, passing through Weimar and Dessau and Berlin, at some point you're in Poland. But with one little exception, my focus will be on how Germany, France and Russia were integrated in in a series of episodes which tell us that the history of architecture and design cannot be told if you stick to a dogmatic and mechanical vision of boundaries, a dogmatic mechanical vision of nations, or even a dogmatic mechanical vision of internationalism, using terms like the international style or others. So I've been always interested in transnational history, in what happens across the borders when ideals, when models, when forms are exchanged, when people travel, when ideas travel, when books travel. And I think that it's still the experience of the Erasmus generation in Europe now, and it's one of the great things we need to thank Europe for, has been an experience of precisely crossing the borders and creating new cultural patterns. But this is by no means new, and it started with the Bauhaus. So the Bauhaus, as you know, and let me give some very preliminary definition, was created in 1919 in the small Thuringian city of Weimar, where the Belgian architect Henri van der Velde had built, before World War I, an art school and a school of applied arts. The Beaux-Arts was created in 19 after the war, and after a discussion among the various politicians who took the decision, they invited the relatively young architect Walter Gropius to become the director. What you see here is the frontispiece of the first Bauhaus Manifesto, the Cathedral of Socialism, which is, I think, a very good illustration of the ideal aspect of the early Bauhaus, building a new world. On the model, Bauhaus refers to Bauhütte, to the little building which was on the building site of cathedrals, where the masons and the architects would work together at making the thing happen. So a reference to medieval times, but at the same time, the star, which was the star of revolution. The first program of the Bauhaus is interesting because of all it says, and I will not be very long. It is a program in which we return to the crafts, architects, sculptors, painter. We all must return to the crafts. This is the first point. Another point which is very important here is the aspiration to unity, to the unified work of art, the Gesamtkunstwerk, which was already the ideal of the European intellectuals for at least one generation. So, and the conclusion is avoiding the distinction between monumental and decorative arts. So this is the way the Bauhaus started. The Bauhaus operated for nearly 14 years and remained a very small school. And if I might make a strong point in the beginning, is that in the end, the Bauhaus trained very few architects and was only, in a relatively belated and limited manner, a school of architecture. It remained essentially a school of applied arts. So very quickly, before coming to the point of my lecture, I need to situate what is the Bauhaus, or rather, if I use the German plural, the Bauhäuser, the different Bauhaus. They were, in fact, at least 3 of them in their, or maybe 4, in 4 different stages, and also with different orientations. So the Bauhaus started in 1919 with a phalanx of remarkable artists who became teachers, Paul Klee on the left, and Rohe, who was a very young teacher at an early age, and who developed his career at the Bauhaus and beyond. And this is the first point I want to make. The Bauhaus what we understand by Bauhaus is both the educational program, but also a sort of the galaxy of the work done by all the teachers. The early Bauhaus in Weimar was a strange institution in which some mystical currents were to be found, not at all the rational and objective later Bauhaus, in particular with the teaching of Johannes Itten, who had was a supporter of a religion borrowed from ancient Persia called Mazdaism. So the early Bauhaus has a sort of mystical orientation. It built a curriculum in which students were, in a way, drawn to study the materials, the textures, and start their aesthetic strategies, develop their aesthetic strategies only on the base of an excellent knowledge of materials and basic techniques. So this is what you see here with the work on materials, with the work done on textile, which was a very important component of the program. It was also a school where painting and theater were sometimes articulated, for instance, in the work of Oskar Schlemmer, who worked on the movements of the body and developed his famous triadic ballet. Schlemmer, at the same time, was engaged, and this is an example of the aspiration to the Gesamtkunstwerk in the decoration of the Bauhaus in Weimar, and later memorialized in this painting the Bauhaus in Dessau. Kandinsky, who was a painter, a rather mysterious painter in his work, did a great effort to objectivize his teachings, and the Bauhaus, one of the major legacies of the Bauhaus is the teaching method he developed in the sphere of the arts. The Bauhaus was also there at a very early stage a public institution. It started in 1923 with the first exhibition organized in Weimar. Here you see a postcard by Kandinsky and a poster by Schmidt. So the Bauhaus revealed its activity to the wider world in 1923, inviting other members of radical architecture and art in Europe, like Theo van Doesburg, Lisitsky, or Le Corbusier. The Bauhaus used, and this is very important, its own buildings as demonstration spaces. We've seen Schlemmer's stairs. This is here what Schmidt did in other stairs in the Weimar building, and on the right the office of Gropius in Dessau, which was meant to be a sort of ideal representation of the pedagogy. Gropius used the Bauhaus as a sort of space of expansion for his practice. And here I want to focus a little bit on the work in parallel on the program which I've mentioned and the work of Gropius himself. Why? Because the work of Gropius has been over the years, and especially after the Second World War, has been, in a way, has operated as the illustration of the Bauhaus culture. But it was very different, was very personal, and was dealing with other issues. So Gropius was interested in the mass production of houses, in the definition of an elementary architecture which could be mass-produced. This is what he exhibited in 1923 in Weimar. The Bauhaus, under his direction, was experimenting in the field of domestic architecture with the experimental house am Horn by Muche, with this very early prefabricated steel house by Polik and also Muche, whereas Gropius had a highly individual and personal architecture, which was also put under the banner of the Bauhaus. His monument to the Märzgefallene, to the victims of the Kapp Putsch in Germany, which was demolished by the Nazis and rebuilt by the communists, and of course the demonstrative building of the Bauhaus itself in Dessau. So what is really strange in the case of the Bauhaus is the complete identification sometimes of the school as an institution and a program and a group of people, and the building representing the school. The building itself is really important in the history of modern architecture, as it is a clear illustration of functionalism, in which the composition of the building is based on the assembly of basic functions. The workshops here with plenty of daylight, the administrative building connecting the workshops with the classes on this side with more measured daylight, the flat box of the auditorium, and finally here the building, the housing the students, the dormitories. So the Bauhaus in a way was a sort of performative building, announcing as it was being built that the program of the school was based on a functional view of architecture. Gropius made other buildings, the houses of the Meisters, which were a sort of mini Gesamtkunstwerke where Kandinsky or Gropius could display their work. Gropius also worked at some other buildings for Dessau which are very important. This one is the labor office, which was a super functionalist building. It was a building meant to receive unemployed workers who would wait outside and enter the building by all these peripheral doors. If they were accepted for a job after the first conversation, they would continue to the center of the building to be examined and finally get a contract. If they were not accepted, they would be quickly evacuated by the circular corridor. So for me, this building, which was in a way very cynical, a machine to process people, is a good expression of the extreme functionalist which was taught by Gropius. Another building, another scheme by Gropius reflects the ambitions or the illusions of the institution. It's the model housing scheme of Turton, completely industrialized, one of the first experiments in prefabrications on the model of the factories of Ford, which had impressed Gropius very much, as well as the entire European culture in the 1920s. Gropius also worked at more innovative buildings, the multiplication theater for Erwin Piscator, in which the space could take many different configurations, for which Rohe also worked, and continued his work to the 1934 when he left Germany for England and later the US. The Bauhaus was also a place where students very quickly became Meister or masters. This was the case of Breuer, who worked from the early 20s to the mid-20s at modernizing the form of furniture, this using a steel tube. This armchair, which was later called Vasily, is one such example. Breuer managed to implement the program of Gropius, which was basically of using the school as a studio for the making of industrial products. So his furniture was produced by Tonet and brought lots of money to the Bauhaus, much more than public money in the end. 1928, Gropius moves out of the Bauhaus to continue the profession, and a new director comes in, who was already active, a Swiss architect by the name of Hannes Meyer, who was an even more radical functionalist than Gropius, and definitely more to the left. Hannes Meyer was famous because of his project at that time in the League of Nations competition in Geneva, a project in which all the components of a building, the big auditorium, the towers, were completely separated and differentiated. At the Bauhaus, he really introduced a systematic teaching of architecture, which had not existed before. It's very important to note that architecture as such was only marginally taught under Gropius, and only with Meyer in 1928 it became an object of systematic and methodologically grounded teaching. This is what an example of the work of students of Meyer working on the detailed functional organization of buildings, on their orientation, on their siting. Together with the students also, Meyer was able to build several structures students were engaged in the making of this very austere-looking apartment block in Dessau, and they also took part to what remains to this day the masterpiece of Meyer, the School of the Unions, the German Unions in Dessau, which has been splendidly restored, really a trip to make, a building which breaks with this sort of rigid functionalism of previous projects and is organized in a very organic manner in the landscape. Building which has very wonderful proportions, which has a sort of internal fluidity, a great building which really qualifies Meyer as a much better architect than Gropius. Meyer was also the first to introduce city planning. City planning was not taught at the Bauhaus. Meyer invited many lecturers, sociologists or critics like the Czech Karel Teige and other psychologists and other specialists, and Hilbersheimer, who started the course of city planning in Dessau. Then the third director, and my little history will stop there, was Miss Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who took the rudder, the control of the school in 1930. Meyer had been expelled for political reasons. He was supported and was supporting the communist group among the students. In conflict with the municipality, he was expelled he had to leave the Bauhaus. He was also in conflict with senior teachers like Paul Klee, for instance. This is a story which has yet to be told in detail. Mies, who had just completed the extraordinary Tugendhat-Haus in Brno, who was emerging as one of the major figures in German architecture. He had been coordinated the Weissenhofsiedlung in Stuttgart in 1927, took the control of the school and developed an even more architecturally oriented curriculum. One would say that among maybe the Bauhaus trained 120 architects in 14 years. Not very many. 120 in 14 years. Half were trained under Mies between 31 and 33. Here you see by Pius Pahl projects which are in the spirit of big urban compositions of Hilbersheimer or perhaps Le Corbusier. Here by Hess and Salmanagic, who was Serbian, functional city planning at a new scale. So the scale of the designs changes also at the Bauhaus under Mies. And it's also under Mies that the Nazis, who are taking control of the local government in Dessau, close the Dessau institution. Here you see a drawing by the students on the left, caricature, and a fantastic montage by Yamawaki, who was Japanese, one of several Japanese students. This leads me to say that the Bauhaus was, because of its teaching body, Paul Klee was Swiss, Meyer also, Moholy-Nagy was and Breuer were Hungarian. The Bauhaus was not a purely German institution, and the students were very, very diverse. Some were coming from Italy, several were coming from Japan, several from the United States, so other from other parts of Europe. So the Bauhaus was really, through both students and teachers, an international institution. Mies managed to bring the Bauhaus to an abandoned factory in Berlin-Steglitz, and in 1932, where it survived for barely 1 year. After the takeover of the Nazis closed the Bauhaus once, and when Mies, who was ready to work with the Nazis, he was totally ready, and instead in Germany until 1938, very late, Mies decided to close it after the Nazi ministry had asked him to fire all the Jewish professors, in particular Kandinsky. So the Bauhaus was closed, dissolved itself in the summer of 1933. Okay, so this is the story, very short story. Now, one question. What are we understanding under the term Bauhaus today? And I would say that there are two definitions. One definition is the narrow one. The Bauhaus as defined, for instance, by this very important exhibition which took place in New York in 1938 at MoMA, organized by Gropius and Bayer. As you see, the Bauhaus here, the Bauhaus is limited to 19 to 28. The exhibition Gropius made in New York left aside the period of Mayer and the period of Mies. So it was, if you want, the initial Bauhaus, with a focus on the buildings of a school. You see the model of a Dessau building, and on the educational program. This is the narrow definition of the Bauhaus. Buildings in which teachers develop a particular program with groups of students. This is the narrow Bauhaus. And there is the broad definition of the Bauhaus, which seems to be the one everyone uses today. The Bauhaus becomes everything. Every piece of modern design is labeled Bauhaus. And I take the example of Tel Aviv and this rather ridiculous Bauhaus center. Tel Aviv is, as you probably know, is basically a new city built in the 1920s and 30s, where you can find 3,000 modern or modernist or modernistic houses, but only 3 among the 100 architects active there had anything to do with the Bauhaus. In particular, Aryeh Sharon, who built some very good housing, which had nothing to do with what the Bauhaus had done. So the Bauhaus becomes what? It becomes a slogan, or rather a synecdoche, a sort of metonymy, if I use the rhetorical figure, a metonymy of modernity at large. The Bauhaus means, the term Bauhaus means much more than Bauhaus. And so this explains the expansion of the celebratory discourse which we see now. But in this presentation today, I wanted to stick relatively closely to the narrow definition of the Bauhaus, and to tell you a story which goes from Paris to Moscow and beyond, maybe to almost to the Pacific Ocean. I want to insist on what I will not call influence, because this term disturbs me a lot. It's too linear, it's too limited. I would rather insist on the reception or the interaction of the Bauhaus with national scenes. And this touches me very closely. I will start here with the western side, with Paris, because when I was an architecture student in my second year, perhaps, I discovered the Bauhaus thanks to this exhibition, which had been organized by the federal Germany, by the German government, which had started, I think, in Amsterdam, in Stuttgart, and developed and traveled throughout Europe. In Amsterdam, went to the US. It was a massive show with 1,500 exhibits, which really suddenly made the Bauhaus alive again for many, many people. There were also still many survivors who took part to the project, which was, as you see, extending the Bauhaus to 69. New York was 28, this is 69, so including the Nachgeschichte, the story of the Bauhaus after 33, but also leaving aside largely all the contribution of Hannes Meyer, who was not a welcome character in Western Germany, whereas he was celebrated widely in Eastern Germany. If I stick to Paris, and let me look at Paris only very briefly, well, not very briefly, but rather systematically, even if rapidly, the production of the Bauhaus was then discussed in a series of manifestations in Paris. The Paris-Berlin exhibition, which was opened at the Centre Pompidou 1 year after the completion of the center, and this little exhibition, Architectures in Germany, of 1979, with a collage, in both cases, collage by one of my former France at that time, Roman Cislewicz, the fantastic Polish graphic designer. Since that moment, the study of the Bauhaus and its interaction with France has developed in many ways. This is, for instance, a collective book published 17 years ago in which all the aspects of this failed interaction are discussed. Why failed interaction? Because France, at that time, after the victory over Germany in 1918, was totally Germanophobic. Only very small circles were interested in what was happening in Germany. And France was still trying to get a revenge over the German productions of the pre-war period. So what you see on the right here is a scandalous exhibition which had taken place in Paris in 1910 of German decorative art and design, let's say interior design, which had a great impact. The French suddenly realized that art industries were developing in Germany and that they would lose their markets abroad if they were not reacting. So hence the idea of a big exposition of decorative arts, which was initially imagined as a response to Germany and which took place ultimately in 1925 and imposed the easy slogan of Art Deco. Art Deco was a response to Germany. So the Germans were invited very late at the Paris show of 25 and refused to come. So at this exposition, you had no German presence or only very marginally. So at the same time, there was already a real discussion of the Bauhaus in the radical circles. And the most significant one was the discussion by Le Corbusier in the journal he had founded in 1920, L'Esprit Nouveau, the New Spirit. Le Corbusier had been invited by Gropius to show some designs in Weimar in 23, and he received as a present the book published in Weimar at that time, and reacted in his journal with an article entitled Pedagogy, in which, without knowing much, he criticized what the Bauhaus was doing. In particular, he found it too artistic and not dealing enough with the question of the standard, which was a preoccupation for him. So not standardized and not industrialized enough. In the following year, he published, and then he asked an article. He asked Gropius to send an article, which was published in 1924. You see it here. It's one of the very few texts by Gropius published in Paris. And in parallel, he published, and the pointer is no longer pointing, but you see on the left this page of the journal where L'Esprit Nouveau affirms its support when the Weimar Bauhaus was closed. And it's a very interesting page in which even the typography without capital letters is developing out of the aesthetic of the Bauhaus. Le Corbusier at that time was extremely anti-German. He had been very pro-German before 1914, and during the war had worked at a book called France or Germany, ? In which he was writing the parallel history of both countries. And as you see on the right, he was open to the Germans, but only to a certain degree. So the first presence, public presence of the Bauhaus on the French scene would be 1926, when André Lursa, whom you see on the left, who was a radical architect, who was also received in Warsaw among at the time of the first lectures on contemporary architecture organized by the people publishing Presence in 26. Lursa, who was not anti-German, organized in Nancy a show where the Bauhaus was present. Lursa at that time was working with Christian Zervos. Zervos was the publisher of a journal called Cahiers d'Art, in which the first full discussion of the Bauhaus in Dessau was to be found. So you had, again, this is very marginal on the French scene, very elitist and very radical, I've closed it, a very radical scene. Servos discusses the Bauhaus. And then something very important happened, which was in a way the response of Germany to the 1925 Exposition. So you see, it's a period in which a sort of ping-pong game takes place between France and Germany, an exhibition response to another one. This one was memorable because and it's memorable in the history of exhibition architecture. It was organized under the banner of the Werkbund, but by Bauhaus people, by Gropius and Herbert Bayer. And you see this remarkable display of architecture. Look at the section here, breaking with a vertical planar display of architectural images in order to create a sort of surrounding effect. This is very memorable. And in the middle, the model of the Bauhaus. Here you see the side view, the Bauhaus, the photographic panels, and chairs, the chairs by Marcel Breuer, which were suspended on the wall. So this is a really significant moment. This is the interior of a collective lounge in a big residential building. This was the title, designed by Gropius and Bayer. So the Germans displayed extremely radical interiors, which were much more advanced than the French ones, with the exception of Le Corbusier. A big discussion developed. The press was massively against. People considered that this was not a proper domestic setting, that this looked pretty much more like a surgical operation room, and that people would never live in hospital wards. So the Germanophobia expressed itself in the critique of this project. The left-wing critiques being no less harsh, and the left-wing critiques attacked the cost of all this furniture, saying that it was not a furniture adapted for workers who were earning the minimal wage. This is, of course, very true. So 31 is a very important moment in this reception, not of the narrow Bauhaus, but of what could be identified with its production. And interestingly, Hannes Meyer and Kandinsky tried to be present in the exhibition, which was completely controlled by Gropius, and tried to have Cahiers d'Art published a special issue with their positions, which were opposed to Gropius. But in the end, the only thing Cahiers d'Art did was to publish a text by the critic Will Grohmann, and what you see is rather interesting. I've not translated well the title. The title is the Dessau Bauhaus Academy of a New Plastic Expression. So the idea that the Bauhaus was becoming a new academic institution, which it was, of course, refusing. 1933, the Bauhaus is closed in Berlin, and diaspora begins. And this diaspora will take Walter Gropius to England and America, Joseph Albers to America. Gropius will develop the Bauhaus pedagogy at Harvard University. Albers will develop the Bauhaus pedagogy at the Black Mountain College. Moholy-Nagy will develop the Bauhaus pedagogy in Chicago, and Mies van der Rohe in his own version, which was very personal, also in Chicago. So the United States were the classic terrain to which the ideas and the people of the Bauhaus migrated. And so the official history, you found, for instance, in the 69 German exhibition, and in most publications to this day, and the official history written in the US is that the Bauhaus goes to America, which is partly true. But it's only partly true because there were other migrations, and I've been interested, and also other scholars. There are lots of new dissertations written by very brilliant young historians interested in other patterns of migration. So Paris, for instance, is where Wassily Kandinsky arrives, and he developed his workshop, and his first very large exhibition of abstract painting is organized in Paris by Christian Zervos, the publisher of the journal you've seen, of Cahiers d'Art. The teaching methods of the Bauhaus are developed by a very small atelier, not by the École des Beaux-Arts. The École des Beaux-Arts rejected, which was the dominant school in France for 150 years, massively refused any input coming from Germany. And it was André Lursa, this modern architect, who was, again, a jealous competitor and relatively talented competitor of Le Corbusier, who created a studio where he introduced two techniques used at the Bauhaus, which were unknown at the Beaux-Arts, where the students were making watercolors and where models were prohibited. So he introduced the study of functional diagrams here and the making of models. It sounds banal today. Every school of architecture is working with models, now computer models, but still cardboard models. At that time, it was very exceptional. And here is the only press clipping I have found, which shows when the production of the studio Lursa is shown, the work of a series of students. There is a certain Wlodarczyk, who might be Polish. I don't know anything else about him. And the one who interests me was called Ernst Schulz, because he was a student of the Bauhaus in Berlin, who was continuing to study in Paris with Lursa, and who later went to fight against the Nazis in Spain and ended up being a high-profile diplomat and public figure in Eastern Germany, who still remembered. I still talked with him in the 80s, and he remembered these episodes. Other émigrés to France are painters, engravers, photographers. So here, Albert Flocon, born Menzel, who illustrated books here, plates for a book by Paul Éluard after the war. Flocon became a teacher in the School of Architecture, where he taught essentially perspective. Jean Liebchen, another painter, another abstract painter, who was quite present on the Paris scene. And finally, this wonderful person, Ressoupeau, who was a photographer and who worked with, who made many books and many photographic essays after the war in Paris. So there was a significant diaspora of the Bauhaus in Paris, people who, of course, had difficult times during the war. But now I wanted to go, to move on a little bit in time. After these episodes in the 1930s, the Bauhaus was basically forgotten in France. It was no longer mentioned by anyone. It had completely disappeared from the radar screens. And it was revived only very, very briefly before the '69 show in the mid-'60s by Georges Candilis, who was one of the members of Team 10, who was a great friend of people like the Smithsons, like Giancarlo De Carlo, Aldo van Eyck, or Oscar and Sophia Hansen. And here you see is a very superficial and very badly informed presentation of the style and the Bauhaus as precursors of the architecture of the 1960s. At the same time, and here I'm moving from west to east, it is at the same time that the Soviets rediscover the Bauhaus. 62, the first article after 30 years, after 30 years of silence, by a literary critic by the name of Pajitnov, who publishes 2 articles on the creative legacy, Tvorческое наследие Bauhausa, on the creative legacy, in which he doesn't discuss architecture at all. The work of Mayer is vaguely mentioned in 7 lines in a corner of these 2 articles. But these articles were important for Eastern Germany. You see on the right the translation. The Eastern Germans, of course, needed to have a signal from the Soviets to do something, otherwise they would not have moved. So they followed immediately and translated Pajitnov in order to say, if the Russians, if the Soviets now reopen the file of the Bauhaus, we can as well follow. So they started talking again about Mayer. The former Bauhaus people were allowed to speak up, and they started their own reception, which is a history per se, which I won't discuss today. But let me stick with the Russians. First of all, a parallel. A new school had also emerged in Moscow in 1920, 1 year after the Bauhaus, called the Mies for higher technology and art workshops. The Mies were way larger than the Bauhaus. There were similarities in the study plans, and here is the Mies plan according to Anya Bokova, who has recently written a very good doctorate on this question at Yale University. And you see that in the Bauhaus you had the Vorlehre, the preliminary course on materials and textures, and then you moved through the various materials, through the study of the various materials, glass, color, fabric, you moved finally to Bau in the center. So the objective, which I've shown with the 1919 Manifesto program, the great building as the Gesamtkunstwerk for everyone. So there was this movement towards the great building. And at the Mies, things were different. There were painters, there were graphic designers, there were wood workers in the studio led by Lisitsky, metal workers in the studio led by Rodchenko, and they were all going to different professions. So the Mies were much broader. At the same time, they trained probably 10 times as many architects as at the Bauhaus. So the parallel is rather misleading, although there were relationships between the two. The Russians developed a sort of mass method of education. They trained hundreds of kids who had no secondary education, and they developed very simple educational procedure to that. So the parallel is interesting, but it should remain a parallel. In 1927, the Russians organized in Moscow, the first exhibition of contemporary architecture. Why contemporary? The term modern in Russia was tainted. Modern was associated with Jugendstil, Secession, etc. So it could not be used. So the new architecture was called Savremenная, contemporary. And when the OSA, the Union of Contemporary Architects, i.e. the constructivists led by Alexander Vyesnin and Moise Ginsburg, organized their first exhibition in Moscow, it was the first and would remain the first and the last, they gave a lot of space to Germany and an entire room at the Bauhaus. So this is, interestingly, the first exhibition of the Bauhaus abroad, full exposure of the buildings. Of course, you vaguely guess the Dessau building, but also the pedagogy, and this took place in Moscow. So the Russians tried to organize exchanges with teachers and students at the Bauhaus. It never went very far, but the Journal of the Constructivists, Современная архитектура, published, for instance, the most extensive discussion of the Haus am Horn, which you see here. When Mayer took over, the program of Mayer was also presented, as well as the Bernau School, which you've seen before. So in a way, the programs in Dessau had a very, very large echo in Moscow. And finally, or on another plan, when Ginsburg tried to define what was the method of constructivism in architecture, he simply borrowed the ideas, the functionalist ideas of Gropius. You see here that his article is illustrated by the Dessau building, and also that in a corner on the right, he publishes the program of the Bauhaus. So, and here, of course, there is more than a relationship between institutions. I have to go back to politics. The relationship between Soviet Russia and Germany were very warm and very intense since the so-called Rapallo Agreement of 1922. They were united against the West and had many joint programs in terms of the production of military equipment, in terms of economy, in terms of culture. The two countries were very close, and the exchange, at least until 1930, the exchange of visit was very intense, with people like Lisitsky traveling constantly from one side to the other. So Germany and Russia had a very warm relationship during these years. And the Bauhaus was interested in other people than the Frutemas people, and in particular in the work of Malevich, who was teaching in Leningrad in his own Institute of Artistic Culture, which was coming under the hegemony of the Russian Museum during those years. The book series of the Bauhaus, which was coordinated by Henoch, included this book by Malevich, The Non-Objective World, published in 1927. In 1927, Malevich, who had exhibited his work in Warsaw, as is well known, went to Dessau and visited the school. And here you see one page of essay where you have this extraordinary photo, very small photo, which I have enlarged, of a melancholic Malevich looking at the glass wall of the Bauhaus. And so it's a very important visit. It's not the only one. Lisitsky and Gropius also came to Dessau, but I haven't found so far the evidence of their reflections. Whereas for Malevich, there is one very good source, which is one printed in Krakow. So it's my allusion to Poland today. Malevich went to Dessau together with Tadeusz Piper, who wrote a very interesting article, which is a narration of the visit. And he explains that Malevich came a little bit for an unplanned visit. He met Gropius, and that Gropius invited to his house, which you've seen, Kandinsky, with whom the discussion was apparently not friendly at all, but in Russian, so no one understood. He invited Henoch and Mies van der Rohe, and I had a very intense discussion with Gropius, saying, you're working on architecture. Architecture is material, has to do with the materials, and is objective, and I'm working, I'm doing architectonics. Malevich has produced his famous Architectoni, which were three-dimensional composition in plaster. I'm working with architectonics, that is, with architecture understood as art. So very interesting discussion, which maybe could be researched a little more. Also, people like Ilya Ehrenberg, who was a great friend of Lisitsky and a Soviet writer present in Germany, went to the Bauhaus. But and published in the Frankfurter Zeitung a very interesting comment opposed to the extreme functionality of the buildings, which I could read you, but I don't want to be too boring today. Also traveling, there were people going in the other direction. And what I want to discuss now, as the last part of this rapid lecture, is the role of some Bauhaus people in the Soviet Union of that period. So the first one who was really engaged in Moscow was Henoch Shepherd. He was a painter who was the head of the architecture painting department at the Bauhaus. He was the one who had designed the color scheme for the Bauhaus in Dessau, which was really remarkable, in which every function had a particular color, inaugurating techniques which are still widely used in architecture worldwide. He spent 2 years in Moscow, where he was very critical of a new turn at Frutemas, which had been called Frutein, Higher Artistic and Technological Institute. He was very critical because they were returning to classic painting and classic drawing. So he was really extremely negative. And he worked with a series of Russian architects. The first one was Travin, who was building a very large housing estate in Moscow, and Shepherd designed the color scheme of this Shabolovka scheme, which is located close to the radio station of Shukov in Moscow. But more importantly, he worked for one of the most remarkable and rather unique buildings of the entire Soviet architectural avant-garde, the Narkomfin building, the communal house built by Moise Ginsburg for the employees of the Ministry of Finance of Russia. And you see here the schemes he made. So schemes for the corridors, schemes for the collective spaces, defining every type of the color for every place, including on top of the building the penthouse in which Nikolai Milyutin, who was the client for the building, who had paid for the building, was living. And you see his schemes for the interiors and the various types of housing cells, interesting drawings which are axonometric, seen from bottom up, so inverted axonometric, in which he was able to represent the ceiling. He was not, of course, painting the floor, which was hardwood, but the ceiling. And here you see other drawings which he made for the F-type cells. The difference between the two being that the first ones were rather meant for singles or childless couples and were meant to be colder in terms of the colors used, and the F-types, which were meant for larger families with children, were meant to have brighter colors. Then, 1930, something really important happens with a massive migration of Germans to the Soviet Union. And there are two groups. So this is an extremely important episode in the development of modern architecture beyond Germany. Two groups go to Moscow. On the left, as seen on this cover of the journal created by Ernst Mies, Das Neue Frankfurt, German technicians, dozens of them, highly paid, come to Moscow to work at designing new towns and new housing schemes. They're led by Ernst Mies, who was the chief architect of Frankfurt. And they will stay some of them will stay for 4 years, between 2 and 4 years, and they will have a massive role in shaping the principles of Soviet city planning. They were considered in Russian as spetsy specialists. They were paid, they were treated very well. They had conditions of life that the Russian workers and even the Russian architects didn't have, and they were quite active. But they were not considered as friends, as tavarishi, as comrades. Different with Hannes Meyer, who leaves Dessau after having had to resign from the Bauhaus, and you see the caricature on the right, with labels as if he were a package sent on the train from Dessau to Moscow. And he arrives in Moscow, and with a group of young architects who were his students at the Bauhaus, on a political base. He goes there to build socialists, so they will be almost unpaid. They will live in very, very difficult conditions and have a very, sometimes a tragic destiny. Here you see the German left-wing press, the Arbeiter Illustrierte Zeitung, published in Berlin, celebrating, on one hand, saying that the Bauhaus is becoming fascist, and on the other side, showing Hannes Meyer, here Bela Scheffler, one of the members of the Bauhaus, of his brigade, so-called brigade, and some young Soviet architects together in Moscow. So Meyer arrives with a group of enthusiast young people and will continue to propagate the knowledge about the Bauhaus. Here, for instance, upon his arrival, he organizes an exhibition at Vazy. Vazy is the new name of the school which used to be Frutemas, which is now completely normalized, and where the teaching program is a sort of neo-Beaux-Arts program, with the exception maybe of a first semester course which still keeps Frutemas methodology and will continue to do so for a long time. So you see here visitors discovering what has happened to the Bauhaus. Meyer also teaches at Vazy, and this is probably the first case in which the teaching methods of the Bauhaus are exported. Here you see student work where the functional study of programs is proposed by Meyer. In 1931, the very active Museum of Contemporary Western Art, there was one such museum in Moscow, where you could still see works by Picasso and Western abstract painters in the 30s, organizes an exhibition on, as you see, the Bauhaus Ganesa Meyera. So it's exactly the opposite of the Bauhaus shown at MoMA in 38. The Bauhaus shown at MoMA was the Bauhaus of Waltera Gropiusa, very clearly. This is the Bauhaus Meyera, very, very different, short period, and but celebrated as progressive and as more radical in terms of functionality. Important show, and Meyer publishes also a little booklet explaining, which this is the copy of Carl Teiger, which is now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and you see here how the book opens. It opens with a political poster, and inside you find Lenin and Meyer's work. So it's a sort of propaganda piece for Meyer's Bauhaus. This is the team here, or some members of the team, essentially a team which was very international. From Hungary, you had Scheffler and Tibor Weiner. Antonin Urban was Czech. Konrad Püschel and and Tolziner were German. So it was a very mixed brigade, but all of them were really on a sort of internationalist line together in Moscow. They live together in a sort of commune, so it's a very important episode, one which needs to be rehabilitated. Let me say one thing. The history of modern architecture has been often characterized as a history of migrations, but in a very limited way. The migration, for instance, the migration of the Bauhaus people to the US, or the migration of the students of Le Corbusier to Latin America, Eastern Europe, etc. But this episode has been until now almost completely missing from the master narrative. So it's gonna be studied now. There is some solid research. I've done mine marginally, but there are many younger people who have done it. And so I think that this representation will change, and we'll see how important this little, for instance, this little kommunalka, this little shared apartment on the Arbat Square in Moscow was, where you see all the participants of a brigade. Yes, I've not mentioned René Mensch, who was Swiss and who was also part of the group, and you see them in their very minimal living conditions. Meyer and his brigade were engaged in many programs of the 1930s, beginning with the decisive competition for the Palace of Soviets, which was one of the signals of the death of modern architecture and the beginning of Stalinist forced counter-revolution in the arts. So this is the project of Meyer for the Palace of Soviets competition. Of course, he was not selected. You see here the idea on this drawing, the big demonstrations, the idea that it's a sort of huge machine for demonstrations, an idea which you could find in other projects, but the projects selected, as you probably know, were neoclassical or Art Deco, and certainly not radically modern. The team of Meyer essentially worked in the realm of city planning and housing. They contributed to the definition of the new standards for housing, and made many plans for functional cities, in which, as you see here, a radical zoning was proposed, in which, look at the left column here, the study of the orientation and the ecological condition was very well done. This is a kind of city planning which had only marginally been taught by Hilbersheimer at the Bauhaus, and Meyer had no experience as a planner. So it is interesting to see here that you can't really talk about exporting Bauhaus methods to Russia, but rather developing Bauhaus-based methods in this new context without any precedent. Meyer also worked on the plan for a very enigmatic little town. Stalin created in the late 1920s a Jewish autonomous republic in the east of the Soviet Union, very close to the Chinese border, called Birobidzhan, which still exists today with a mixed population. And Meyer worked on the plan for this the little industrial town, which was meant to be the core of this new republic. And finally, I want to mention also the work of Hannes Meyer in the early 30s, when finally the city of Moscow had no real development plan, rather a summary plan of 1924. All the architects present in Moscow were invited to work on, to make proposals for a new plan, including Hannes Meyer. Le Corbusier had made his own relatively dogmatic and even, I would say, nihilistic proposals before. Meyer did worked at what you see here, a plan in which the center city was almost completely demolished, with the exception of a Kremlin and some blocks, and in which a functional city was introduced with a clear differentiation of functional zones. He was not well received, and the final plan of 35, was inspired by the entry of another Meyer. There's another guy called Meyer in Moscow. His name was Kurt Meyer, and he had been the city planner of Cologne for the mayor of Cologne of those years, who was Konrad Adenauer, the future chancellor of Western Germany after the war. So it's rather paradoxical to see the city planner of Adenauer, who, by the way, was a communist, inspiring the plan of Moscow. And later, he was arrested, sent to the Gulag, and died there, like many of these people. So 1935, Meyer almost disappears from the active political, architectural life of Moscow. He's still present. You see him here in his group of architects in 1935. Meyer is the tall guy, the third from the right, close to Colli, who had been the partner of Le Corbusier for his Moscow project. Meyer almost stops to be active in Moscow. He still is an advisor for this journal called Architecture Abroad, which is very significant because it's the last medium between 34 and 36 in which the contemporary Western architecture is disseminated to Soviet audiences. So Meyer is one of the advisors of the journal, but at the same time, clearly, he starts being more involved in politics, and probably this is what now the latest research is showing. After archives discovered in the archive of the former Communist Party of Eastern Germany, the SED, it's clear that he became an organizer for the Comintern and went to Mexico, where he later built schools, essentially to organize the communist movement in Latin America. So, in a way, I would say that he responded in his own way to the question raised by Le Corbusier on the last page of his manifesto of 1923, Vers une architecture, Towards an Architecture. Le Corbusier writes at the end of his book, which was one of the most popular books of the entire 20th century, he writes, architecture or revolution, question mark, revolution can be avoided. Why? By building housing, by responding to the social expectations, one can avoid a big shock. And the response of Meyer was the opposite one. Architecture can be avoided in a certain way. So he drifted toward politics. At the same time, giving to the West, disseminating in the West, a very positive and heroic and triumphalist vision of a program for the new towns, which was received, again, I'm going back to the broader scene. The depression of 1929 had hit the US, but also all of Europe, and the production of cities, the development of cities was really impacted by the crisis in Western Europe. So Meyer and his friend, the Swiss architect Hans Schmidt, could argue that the Soviets, which is also true, were developing at a very high human cost, were developing their cities and their industry. The destiny of the Bauhaus people was very, very heavy, very difficult. So Tolziner went, where is he? Tolziner here went to the Gulag and barely survived and continued to practice architecture, restoring historical monuments in Russia until the 1970s. Püschel was returned to the Germans once his passport was exported, put into jail by the Germans, by the Nazis, then sent to the Russian front during the war, taken prisoner by the Russians, liberated, sent back to Eastern Germany, and he decided, because he was really a hard-boiled guy, he decided to go to North Korea to rebuild North Korea after the war. Just to give you an example, and he was present in the conferences the East Germans organized in the 70s and 80s, and I met him a couple of times. So just to give you an idea of who were these people. Others, like René Mensch, the Swiss guy, went to Iran and built very good structures in Tehran. Bela Scheffler was arrested and would be shot, as well as another German Bauhausler in the Gulag at the end of the 1930s. So altogether, a very high human price for the very generous program, of course, full of illusions they had pursued. And so this was all forgotten when interestingly, when the Russians rediscovered the Bauhaus. They discovered the Bauhaus almost as a source of style. Not by coincidence, the first article I was mentioned after 30 years was published in a journal of decorative arts. So strangely, the early Russian reception, and what will be the case until now was almost a stylistic vision of the Bauhaus. Or, and this is my last image, a reception of a reading of a work done by Mies and Gropius in America. This is the first book ever made in Russia on American architecture, 63, newest American architecture, and you see a project by Gropius and by Mies, the Bauhaus directors. Meyer was completely forgotten at that time. So since things have changed very much, and there have been exhibitions at the Moscow Architectural Institute, and the history is slowly being put together. But this doesn't change anything to my initial point about the two parallel Bauhäuser, the narrow Bauhaus, which is slowly rediscovered with all the very dramatic, sometimes human experiences related to it, while the easy Bauhaus, the broad Bauhaus, the one focused on style and aesthetics, is the broadly understood one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis, for this wonderful lecture. And if we permit, perhaps we will invite the questions from the audience. Please feel invited to ask a question. Yeah.
Question, remarks, opposition?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. It was so exciting and full of so interesting details. And it was great that you told us a lot about all this political context and all these alliances. And I'm wondering how the legacy of Bauhaus was seen when we talk about East and West and in Germany, in DDR, and I assume it is for another lecture, but...
Yes, no, they were clearly, the Bauhaus legacy was divided between East and West Germany. So the West Germans monumentalized the Bauhaus and insisted on the connection with modern art and the connection with industry at a time in which modern art was still abstract art. Modern art was practiced to a certain degree in East Germany, it was clearly not what the official line was. So the Eastern German reception was double, and I remember it because I was almost a kid when I started going there and meeting with old-timers. So the discourse in East Germany was the Bauhaus is important because it was left, so a politicized reading, which was partly true. The Bauhaus was inscribed within the political conflicts of Weimar, and they were clearly not on the side of the Nazis, so that's very clear. And second, the Bauhaus is important because it developed prefabrication, which is now our religion. So they celebrated all these aspects of the interest of the Bauhaus for technologies. This was the official discourse, but at the same time, they were very courageous people. A historian called Hans-Jürgen Winkler, who published the first monograph, another one called Kurt Junghans. I invited these guys in Paris at that time, I could do that. Or one of the directors of the school in Weimar called Bernd Grönwald, who had a very different perception. So they were, I wouldn't say they were in the opposition, there was no such thing, there were no dissidents. They were, in a way, faithful to a sort of utopian vision of Bolshevism, which was complete kitsch in the late Eastern Germany. But for them, the Bauhaus had a very strong meaning, and articles were published. A book was done on a book was published on Gropius, so it became part of the official history of which was taught in Eastern Germany. But it took a long time, and it really started with the 100th anniversary with the 50th anniversary of the Bauhaus, which was celebrated of the Dessau Bauhaus, which was celebrated in '77. That's when they restored the building. The building Dessau was in complete ruin, so they restored it with very primitive means. But primitive means which were very close to the technologies of the 20s. In the late 70s. They did not restore the Meisterhäuser, which were still ruins. But I remember seeing the Bauhaus before and after. It was very different. So this story has been told in particular by Thomas Flierl, who is the son of a very active architect of the East Germany in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and he has worked on this topic recently. So there will be, expect good publications on this topic.
And I have a question about Futemas that you also briefly described. If we Google that even today, we can find that it's often nicknamed as a Soviet Bauhaus, but you also mentioned that it's very different. And I'm wondering from which stage of the Bauhaus reception this misunderstanding comes from, if it's a contemporary one of understanding Bauhaus like as a modern architecture in general, or it's somehow linked to different stages of Bauhaus reception in USSR.
I think it would be an interesting research to do. Who is the first one to draw a parallel? I don't know when it appears. Probably Futemas were really not only forgotten, but a sort of repressed memory until the 70s in Moscow. I remember I was interested as a young architecture student. I knew Russian. I went to Moscow in the mid-70s and still met people like Melnikov and others. So they were beginning, the buildings of the avant-garde were visible. They were early publications, but almost nothing on the Futemas. It really started at the time of the other show at the Pompidou called Paris-Moscow of 1979. So at that time, the slogan Soviet Bauhaus was used in almost a pedagogic manner to say, oh, but it's a sort of Soviet Bauhaus, but it was done in a very superficial way because no one had really studied the teaching programs. There had been a little bit of study of the work of Rodchenko. Khan Magomedov had worked a little bit on the preliminary course, but it's emerging right now. It's emerging right now. The archives are disseminated. There is no such thing as a really organized archive, in contrast to what Gropius managed to organize with the Bauhaus Archive in Berlin. Already in the 1960s, the creation of the Bauhaus Archive was organized. Gropius supported Hans Wingler, who published the first big book of documents on the Bauhaus. It started in the 60s when there were still many Bauhausler alive who contributed, gave their archives. In Moscow, many people had burned their archives during the war. Or under Stalinism, they perceived that their association with the avant-garde was dangerous. So they had burned the archives or torn away pages from books. So some of them had buried photographs in the garden of their dacha, and Han went there and managed to have them dig the stuff out and had an archive which is now disseminated between various collectors in the West. So there's a real issue of archives about Futemas. What we know is based on collections of very small photographs or very fragmentary evidence.
And I have a question vaguely related. What is the attitude towards the constructivist heritage and Putin in Russia nowadays? Because you know it quite well. I mean.
It has changed. I mean, in the first stages of the post-Soviet culture, post-Soviet Russian culture, if you take the example of Moscow, Lushkov, who was the first post-Soviet mayor, wanted total kitsch. So he had a postmodernist taste, and one of the most significant buildings built under his reign was a new Vysotka, a new high-rise building called Triumph Palace, which was a bad copy of the Stalinist skyscrapers. And then things have changed. A generation, the leading architects today in Russia, and the architects are moving forth, were the ones who rediscovered the avant-garde in the 70s when they were students. So things have changed. There are lots of buildings under protection. They have restored some buildings, sometimes horribly, because the notion of restoration, there is no difference between reconstruction and redoing completely anew. So one of the great communal houses, the one of Nikolaev, has been completely torn apart and then rebuilt in a more or less authentic way when you look at it, but it's not the real thing. The house of Melnikov, to give an example, which is now property of the Architecture Museum, is completely kept with all its objects, and I'm chairing the committee for its restoration, and it's completely well. The communal house of Ginsburg, to give another example, is is being restored as a condominium by the grandson of Ginsburg, who does things relatively correctly, but after 50 years of neglect. And if you go to the provinces, I'll give you one example. I was last year in Yekaterinburg in the Urals, which is a very big city and an interesting one. It's a city which has a very strong intellectual life, theatrical, literary life, and a group of people who have created an organization to promote the constructivist legacy, some 100 buildings. So they're putting signs in the streets. There is a communal house by Ginsburg, and they're transforming one apartment into a museum. They organize a yearly festival. They go out into other cities of the Urals to look at industrial cities. So there is really, and it's all made by young people, by students, art students, young historians. And it's very, very moving to see them doing that. So it's, and it's clearly, they're all the people who are in the core, engaged in these initiatives are belong to the democratic opposition to Putin. But at the same time, they have managed to get, if not support, at least get tolerance from the vertushka, from the top, until this point at least. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, it was wonderful. A ja bardzo Państwu dziękuję i zapraszam, ponieważ powiedziałam, że to jest pierwsze wydarzenie. Mamy festiwal Bauhausu w tym i w kolejnym tygodniu, czyli już w czwartek Regina Bittner z wykładem Rzemiosło staje się nowoczesne. Regina, czyli królowa Bauhausu z Berlina, a we wtorek Aleksandra Kędziorek, która jest tutaj, będzie mówiła w przyszły wtorek, czyli 4 czerwca, wszystko już w Goethe Instytut, w rynku głównym, będzie mówiła o Helenie Syrkus i panu Bauhausie, czyli o polskich związkach właśnie z całym ruchem i ze szkołą. Bardzo serdecznie dziękuję Goethe Instytut, dziękuję pani dyrektor Charlotte Hermelink i Dorocie Krakowskiej, która funduje nam kolejny sezon festiwalu z architekturą, no i przede wszystkim naszemu gościowi, bo to było bardzo fascynujące. Dziękuję.